Cuba is an island in the Caribbean, and as such, it might not be the first place one would necessarily associate with communism or socialism, given that the large two powers outside of Cuba that adhered to this philosophy were the Soviet Union and to some degree still today, China. The reason Cuba went down this road is because of the Cuban Revolution, and in this video, I'd like to explore why the Cuban Revolution happened, what happened, and what its consequences were. Before getting into that, a quick word from today's video sponsor, which is Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a paid-for video streaming service with thousands of different documentaries that you can gain access to with a small monthly fee. They cover many different topics like science, nature, and history. I'd like to recommend one in particular, which is called Fidel Castro: Life for the Revolution, which instead of just looking at the basic historical facts of the revolution as I do here, it takes a deeper look by looking at the accounts of his life based on private letters, on the correspondence he had with others, and the speeches and interviews which he gave. So it's a really great watch, and you can have access to this and many other documentaries on similar topics by going to Magellan TV. There's even a special offer for viewers of this channel. You can either go to the description or simply type try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert for a free month of premium membership. It's really worth checking out, so do check it out because that does help out the channel as well, and you can get access to all these great documentaries. But anyway, let's dive into it. Cuba has a long and interesting history. Starting already around 3000 BC, there are archaeological remains for tribes that moved over from what's now North and South America, moving onto the island, although these would largely be displaced by the end of the 15th century, mainly by a group of natives called the Taínos, who would chase out the others to the extreme western end of the island. Of course, life for these peoples would change drastically with the arrival of the Spanish already in 1492, when the north side of the island was explored by none other than Christopher Columbus on that first expedition after making landfall in the Bahamas. Over the subsequent centuries, Cuba was incorporated into the Spanish Empire as part of their holdings in the New World, and the islands changed drastically as a result. The local native population were largely displaced, many dying of disease, and were replaced both by Spanish immigrants and settlers, as well as African slaves who they needed for the large production of sugar. This would be a huge issue in Cuban history and later on as well, both this sugar production, which could make the island incredibly wealthy, and the slaves that were needed for it to carry on. As a result, poor Cubans of both European, African, and mixed origin working on the sugar plantations would clamour for reform, being particularly inspired by the 1776 uprising of the colonies under the British in North America becoming the United States, as well as the 1789 French Revolution, but particularly so for those of African descent, the 1791 Haitian Revolution, in which Haitian slaves took over from their French masters and declared themselves independent. There was a similar slave revolt in Cuba in 1795, but this ultimately failed. However, the French invasion of Spain during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century helped those in Cuba aiming to seek their own independence. However, in the end, they were not able to wrest control from Spain, as despite some liberalizing policies from the Spanish, by 1823, King Ferdinand VII had once again imposed absolutism, and this curtailed many of the freedoms in Cuba, although this would lead to, in the 1830s and 1840s, a greater increase in Cuban nationalism and calls for independence, whether these came from the richer Creole classes who wanted a race-based hierarchical system, or from the very bottom with black slave revolts, or something in between. Slave revolts in particular increased in intensity throughout the 19th century as the British, seeking to end slavery worldwide, pressured the Spanish into promising that they would eventually end slavery. These were dealt with increasingly brutal reprisals. However, it's in the second half of the 19th century that a real Cuban independence movement, especially among the wealthier planters, started to lead to what are termed wars rather than just rebellions against the Spanish authorities, starting in 1868 with the 10 Years' War, in which wealthy planters proclaimed an independent republic and fought for a decade against Spanish authorities, although they were finally defeated. Despite being defeated just a year later as a consequence of unhappiness with the truce that was signed, another war broke out. This war would only last the year though in 1879 and was known therefore as the Little War, and once again this ended in a Spanish military victory over the Cubans. The Spanish did begin to make some concessions, however, as in 1886 they finally banned slavery, and this saw a great change in both the Cuban economy and society, as many wealthy Cubans now had to join the middle classes and lost their sugar mills. However, by 1895 the desire for independence had grown too strong, and Cuban exiles in Latin America and largely from the United States set sail and sought to claim their own independence, thus starting the Cuban War of Independence. This raged on for many years, and they were actually very successful at fighting against the Spanish, claiming large parts of the island, including in the west, which was something that previous rebellions had failed to do. In 1898 as well, however, the United States was becoming increasingly pressured by public opinion and by various journalists and articles that were being written about the war there to get involved and to help the Cubans, as can be seen in this cartoon. This actually escalated much further when the USS Maine, which was a United States naval ship that was sent to La Habana to actually bring out the United States civilians that were caught up in the fighting, was sunk in the harbour, and this led to the American involvement in the war, which then changed the conflict to part of the Spanish-American War that was fought in various places. With the assistance of the Cuban rebels, the United States sent soldiers to the island and fought several battles against the Spanish, successfully defeating their Caribbean squadron at sea and then slowly grinding them down until Cuban independence had been won. However, the United States, as always, wasn't in this solely out of the goodness of their own hearts. And actually already in 1881, James Blaney, who was the US Secretary of State, had said about Cuba when it was still Spanish that rich island, the key to the Gulf of Mexico, is, though in the hands of Spain, a part of the American commercial system. If ever ceasing to be Spanish, Cuba must necessarily become American and not fall under any other European domination. This of course also implying that it should not truly be independent, but should be part of this American commercial system and should fall under their sway. And in 1896, actually, when the war had already been going on for 2 years before American involvement, Spain had actually offered to sell Cuba to the United States, although ultimately they turned this down. After Spain's surrender and the last of its troops had left the island in 1898, originally control went to the Americans rather than to the Cubans, who said that they were safeguarding the democracy until the Cuban government could get on its own feet. However, during this time it would soon become clear that actually the choice the Cubans had would have to be passed through the United States first, and that the United States was making sure during this period when it was control that Cuba would ultimately remain in its sphere of influence, largely through economic but also through several social policies that they would be passing through. In 1902, for example, 40% of all the sugar production in Cuba would be owned by Americans, and this figure only increased throughout the first half of the 20th century. The 1902 Platt Amendment that actually sought to maintain the relationship between Cuba and the United States until at least 1934 lays out just how much control the Americans would have in Cuban affairs until that time. The various stipulations of the Platt Amendment meant that Cuba was left without a lot of its own independence in terms of foreign policy and in terms of its economy, not allowing, for example, the country to maintain any foreign debt without guarantees, as well as allowing the United States to intervene militarily, whether to preserve Cuban independence as well as the property and individual liberty, which actually a lot of the time meant that of the Americans who had invested in the sugar industry and who were owning large parts of it, as well as having to cede several islands to the United States to control. The clause allowing American military intervention on the island was a particularly visible sign that the United States had actually in some ways simply replaced Spain as the new colonial master of the island, as they militarily intervened for their own interests in 1906, 1912 and again in 1916. To this end, the Sergeants' Revolt of 1933 brought out of power a President Machado, who had actually already served his first term and who then carried on as a dictator for another year and was then ousted from power. And this wave actually also sought to get rid of the Platt Amendment, to abrogate it completely, and so sought to diminish the influence of America in Cuba. However, in 1934 this was overthrown by a right-wing reaction against them.